All right, we come back to the book of Kings. We spoke last time about the first major theme of the book of Kings, which is obviously the kings. But an equally important theme that is found within the book is the ministry of the prophets. And it could be argued, and has been argued, and I think there is validity to the argument, that in Kings, really it is more a book about the prophets that God raised up than it is specifically about the kings themselves. In fact, more material is devoted within Kings, as we'll see as we take a look at the literary structure. More material is devoted to the ministries of Elijah and Elisha in Kings than to any of the kings, including Solomon. And so it is important for us to recognize that as you go through the book, that there is a continual ministry of the prophets, both to the kings and to the people that is given within the book. And in fact, when you come to 2 Kings chapter 17, the author makes it very, very clear that Israel, the northern kingdom, went into captivity because of their breaking of their Torah and turning to idolatry. And as you have read Kings, you can certainly recognize what he says in 2 Kings 17, beginning with verse 13. Yet Yahweh warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and every seer, saying, turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments, my statutes, according to all the law which I commanded your fathers, which I sent to you through my servants the prophets. However, they did not listen, but stiffened their neck like their fathers, who did not believe in Yahweh their God. And they rejected his statutes and his covenants, which he made with their fathers, and his warnings, which he had warned them. And they followed vanity and became vain, and went after the nations which surrounded them, concerning which the Lord had commanded them not to do like them. And they forsook the commandments, etc. So verse 18, Yahweh was very angry with Israel and removed them from his sight. And none was left except the tribe of Judah. Now notice he makes it very, very clear that they rejected his statutes and his covenants. Right? That they resisted and rebelled against the covenant that God had given to them through Moses, the first great writing prophet. But notice the author makes it very, very clear that God just didn't say, all right, you disobeyed the covenants. Here comes the covenant curse. You're going to be taken into captivity. But the fact that the Lord consistently sent the prophets to warn them and to call them to repentance and give them a warning that if they did not do so, then certainly the covenants of the covenant would come upon them. And notice he made it very clear in verse 13, Yahweh warned Israel and Judah. And then in verse 19, even though Judah remains, Judah did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the customs which Israel had introduced. And of course, ultimately, that means that Judah, because of their resistance to the will of God, was going to go into captivity as well. And of course, the narrative continues with what had taken place with Israel to pick up the events to take place in the surviving kingdom until ultimately Judah went into captivity as well. But the author makes it very, very clear, even though I'm putting this assessment in, as Israel goes into captivity, understand this also is the narrative that you've been reading that will also culminate in the captivity of Judah as well. And of course, we continue to see in chapters 18 to 25 that God continued to send prophets. Now, the prophetic ministry, and we'll come back to the chart in just a second, but individual prophets are named throughout the book. 9 of them are mentioned along with their ministries. It is very interesting that Solomon's reign begins on the note of prophetic involvement with Nathan in chapter 1, and will conclude with God raising up Ahijah, that we've already looked at toward the end of Solomon's reign, not to bring a message to Solomon, but to bring a message to Jeroboam. And the fact that God would raise up Jeroboam as an adversary to Solomon, and that ultimately, because of Solomon's sin, would have his kingdom established over the 10 northern tribes. And then at the end of Jeroboam's reign, how Ahijah again is sent to say, all right, God established your kingdom, and you refuse to follow him, and so your dynasty is going to come to an end. And we can get into the other prophets, Jehu and his son Hananiah is also spoken of in 2 Chronicles. Elijah and Elisha obviously being the 2 major prophets. Micaiah. Ahab, remember, didn't like Micaiah's prophecies. You know, I've got all these court prophets. I like to listen to them. You know, they tell me good things from Yahweh. Well, is there a true prophet from Yahweh? Well, yeah, Jehoshaphat, but I don't like listening to him because he always has bad news. Always tells me what I don't want to hear. And so we have Micaiah who comes and begins by saying, okay, Ahab, what do you want me to tell you? All right, I'll tell you. And then he's struck because, well, tell me the real thing. You never give me good news. All right, and so he tells Ahab what the Lord really tells him. All right, you're going to die in battle. And so Jehu, of course, dresses up like a common soldier. I mean, that's the way you defeat the prophetic word, isn't it? I mean, if the prophet says you're going to die, well, all right, I won't be like a king. And you read the word, and any good Calvinist can really appreciate this, on how, just where the Aramean soldiers just happened to take an arrow and just happened to shoot it off into the army, not really anticipating who he was going to hit. And right in the one place between the armor of Ehud where an arrow could happen to land and be lethal, it's exactly where the arrow landed. I mean, it wasn't directed that way. It wasn't, the Aramean wasn't saying, there's the king. I'm gonna knock him off. And so, the text is very, very clear that, this is the Lord who is behind all of this, and Ahab, of course, is not able to to die. And Jehoshaphat, who has the regal clothes in the battle in the end is delivered. Well, all that you read it, and of course the narrator is just showing that nothing can defeat the prophetic word. We're going to come back to that in just a second. But there's Micaiah, and then Elisha, Jonah, Isaiah, who will come before us again in 502. There's a little book that he happened to compile of his prophecies that we will look at in 502. And then Huldah the prophetess, who is the one who was consulted during the time of Josiah. And so we see that these prophets, and we'll also take a look at our chart in just a minute and realize along with these who are named, there are some anonymous prophets who show up within the book of Kings as well. The man of God from Judah, and a man of the son of the prophets, etc. So these prophets, and from chapter 1 all the way, as we can see, through chapter 22 of 2 Kings, there is continual prophetic ministry that is given to the kings and given to the nation by the prophets. And we'll just jump ahead to the temple. It's interesting that as you, again, we'll take a look at this in the structure. We'll just get the theme at this point. The most important activity that takes place as far as Solomon's reign is concerned, with the amount of material that is given to us within the Scripture, is the fact that Solomon built the temple. The very heart of the Solomonic narrative deals with him building the temple. From chapter 5, when he gets the material and the artisans from Hiram, until finally in chapter 9, the temple is dedicated and functioning. So we can see that over half of the narrative of Solomon is devoted to his building of the temple. And then really the temple, once it is built, basically is not brought up again in the narrative until the very end of 2 Kings, when God protects the temple and Jerusalem during the time of Hezekiah, the great deliverance that is brought, but ultimately that will not keep the temple from being destroyed. And that echoes what God said back in 1 Kings chapter 9 to Solomon, that if you and your house and your people will truly honor me, then this temple will be established. If not, the temple will be destroyed. And of course, with that echoing as you go through the reading of Kings, realizing that the sons of Solomon did not walk in the ways of the Lord, we know that the ultimate judgment that's going to come upon Solomon and his house is the fact that the temple is going to be destroyed, and that's exactly what takes place. And Kings, through the destruction of the temple, shows that in the end the Solomonic house has not been established, and yet we still have the promise of what was given to David is still before us as you come to the end of Kings. And interestingly, as we get into 502 and the latter prophets, they'll reflect much upon the promise that is given to David. Solomon basically is not going to come before us within the prophets, the latter prophets, because we've already read Kings and realized, all right, it's not his house that's going to be established. David's house is, but it's going to be through some other means, through some other son than one who will be in the Solomonic line. And just put that back. We'll talk about that later when we get into Jeremiah chapter 22. But the author of Kings has made it very, very clear that Solomon builds a temple, and the Lord makes it very, very clear that I will establish your throne, but if you or your sons turn away from following me, I'll cut off Israel, and the house which I consecrated for my name I will cast out of my sight. And by the end of 2 Kings, that has taken place. And yet we need to recognize, we've already talked about chapter 22 of 1 Kings, being an emphasis upon the fact that Yahweh is sovereign, but the way it is particularly seen, and I charted out for you, is as you go through the book of Kings, is to recognize that as you are reading this book, that we have the sending by Yahweh of the prophets. And as they come, they utter prophecies. And the amazing thing is, as you read in the book of Kings, the author makes it very, very clear that Yahweh sovereignly fulfills the word of the prophets. That every prophetic word that is uttered within this book finds fulfillments within the book. And I have listed them for you. Now, some are very, very, near. Obviously, the prophet will utter a prophecy of what is going to take place within his lifetime. But also, you have prophecies which span the book. And, of course, the most famous of these is the one that we find in 1 Kings chapter 13, where we have this man of God of Judah who comes to Bethel, who in verse 2 cries out against the altar that Jeroboam had established in Bethel, and said, O altar, altar, thus says the Lord, behold, a son shall be born to the house of David, Josiah by name. So myself for uttering general prophecies that then later on you can look back and say, oh, that must have been the word of the Lord. Josiah by name. And on you he shall sacrifice the priests of the high places who burn incense on you, and all human bones shall be burned on you. Now, an immediate prophetic word is the fact that the altar will be split apart. And sure enough, in verse 5, the altar was split apart, and the ashes were poured out. So there's an immediate prophecy that comes to pass right as the prophet is giving his prophecy. That's the near word which validates the reality that his far word is going to come to pass. And so here it is. And then when you go over to 2 Kings chapter 23, and we are in the narrative dealing with Josiah, and you come to verses 15 and 16. Furthermore, the altar that was at Bethel and the high place which Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel sin, had made, even that altar and the high place he broke down. Then he demolished its stones, ground them to dust, and burned the Asherah. Now when Josiah turned and saw the graves that were there on the mountain, he sent and took the bones from the graves and burned them on the altar and defiled it according to the word of the Lord, which the man of God proclaimed, who proclaimed these things. All right, remember what was in the narrative in chapter 13 of 1 Kings? All right, the narrator doesn't want you to miss. This is the fulfillment specifically of exactly what that man of God said, and giving his word somewhere around 930 BC, and here we are in about 621 BC, almost 300 years later, and here it is. It came to pass just exactly as it was prophesied that it would happen. Now, what Kings is doing is not just pointing out, all right, this prophetic word is fulfilled, but as you take a look at the totality of the chart that is here, what the author of Kings is saying to Israel in exile is realize you rejected the word of the prophets. But every word that the prophets utter that speaks about the future comes to pass. In other words, you should not ignore what the prophets have said. And by the way, it's very interesting, again, the Jewish canon, that you finish reading Kings with this message. Hear what the prophets have to say. That the very next portion of the Old Testament is what? The latter prophets. In other words, learn the lesson from the narrative. The prophetic word is trustworthy. And you can look back in Israel's history and Jews' history and see that is true. And then you get right into reading Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12. And you're saying, these are validated prophets too. They gave near prophecies that came to pass. Just as you see within the book of Kings, which validates that as they talk about the future, God is going to bring that prophetic word to pass. So there's the prophet, there's the prophecies, there's the fulfillments. And certainly Kings is establishing the credibility of the prophets that Yahweh sends to his people. And I think there's a synopsis question that talks about the prophetic word that is in Kings. Well, here it is. The prophetic word comes to pass. And of course, as you read, and particularly 2 Kings chapter 17, the ultimate prophetic word that came to pass was the prophetic word that was given through the first writing prophet Moses, who had already spoken about these things. They turned away from the commandments, and certainly the judgments that he had predicted came upon the nation of Israel. So not just the prophets within the book, but also the fact that the word of prophecy has come to pass. And it's against that backdrop then that you are to read the scripture as far as the latter prophets are concerned. So here is the sovereignty of Yahweh displayed within the book of Kings. That is the fulfilled words of the prophets. And so what is the purpose of the book? That we can summarize it this way. That the human monarchy, including the Davidic house, as represented within the line of Solomon and the Solomonic kings that followed him, failed to follow Yahweh, with the result that Israel and Judah were taken from the land in fulfillment of the prophetic word. And you need to see the prophetic word being behind what is taking place in the narrative within this book. So, yeah, as you read the book of Kings, and I went through the same thing that you did the first time I read Kings 2, and that is you really get wrapped up in the kings. And you get wrapped up with all of the issues of the kings and trying to keep the kings straight. And yet to realize that, yes, it is about the kings, but it's about the prophetic involvement with the kings, the prophets, and with the people. And within the fact, in the end, what is established is the prophetic word. And the prophetic word has truly come to pass in what took place in Israel's past. Now, when we get to the structure of the book of Kings, we can see immediately that, and I think every exegete I've ever read, this is pretty clear cut as far as the overall thrust of Kings is concerned. You've got the basic narrative along with an epilogue. Okay, you got an appendix at the end, and that's exactly what you have here. You have two paragraphs, two basic events that take place after the major part of the narrative has come to a conclusion. But as you read through the narrative, it's very, very clear. The first 11 chapters deal with the single kingdom, the kingdom of Solomon. The kingdom that had been established by David. And 1 Kings 1 and 2 makes it very, very clear that Davidic kingdom was then established under Solomon just before David's death. There is a time of what is known as co-regency. There is a time when David is still alive as king, when Solomon has been acclaimed as king. We don't know how long that time period was, but we'll come back to this with the chronology of the kings. And that is, whenever you do have a co-regency, there's an overlap there where those days are considered both a part of the previous king's reign and then the new king's reign. In other words, Solomon's declared king and begins his kingly reign before David dies. Then David passes away, and Solomon takes over David's kingdom. And as I said, the great event of Solomon's reign is the building of the temple. Then we have the heart of the narrative. Makes up over half of the book. 57% of the book is devoted to the narrative of the divine kingdom, with a record of the kingdom of Israel and Judah. And we've already brought this out in Kings as opposed to Chronicles. The divided kingdom will concentrate in its narrative upon the northern kingdom. You read Kings and you should realize you have found more during the period of the divided kingdom about the north than you have about the south. The author has concentrated his narrative upon what took place in the north. We talked about that last time, the extended narrative on Ahab that consumes from the latter part of chapter 16 all the way through chapter 22 of the book of Kings. That of all of the kings of the divided kingdom, the one that the narrator focuses his most detailed attention is upon Ahab. And the interesting thing is that Ahab was not viewed by the records that have come to us outside of Israel as being as important as his father, and then the king who will follow him when Jehu establishes his dynasty. Because really, what happens during the time of Ahab is that God raises up a prophet by the name of what? Elijah. And Elijah confronts Ahab. And then as the house of Omri continues, as Elijah is taken up into heaven, as it continues, and then the establishment of Jehu's dynasty, that the prophet who comes after that, Elisha, is the Lord's spokesman to the continuing house of Omri, and then the establishment of the house of Jehu. And how extensive is the material as far as the north is concerned, and the interaction of Elijah and Elisha. In fact, as Kings, as the author of Kings begins the narrative concerning the divided kingdom, he speaks in chapter 12 about the division that took place under Rehoboam. And then he shows you where his sympathies are going to lie, because in 12:25, then Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. Jeroboam said in his heart, and then we have the record concerning Jeroboam. And it's only when finally he is done with Jeroboam that he turns back in chapter 14, verse 21. Now Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, reigned in Judah. Now I've told you what happened in the north. Let me go back and pick up the narrative of now what has taken place in the south. And this tips you off, right? The very beginning of the narrative in the divided kingdom, where the focus of this writer during this time is going to be seen. It's on Israel and what took place in the northern kingdom. And basically what takes place in the south is just brought in almost as it were to fill out the detail of what was happening within the north. Now the chronicle is going to turn that topsy-turvy. He's going to concentrate upon the kings of the south in Judah and just bring in the kings of the north when they happen to impinge upon. Now, to really understand what is taking place, you need to understand, okay, here's what was taking place in the north. But he's going to focus upon the south, where the author of the Kings during the divided kingdom will focus upon the north. Then, in chapter 18, obviously, his focus has to become Judah, because Israel's been taken into captivity in 722 BC. And so the latter portion of the book will focus upon the surviving kingdom, and this is where Judah is taken into captivity, and ultimately the temple is destroyed. And yet, at the very end, a remnant is left in the land, and what a wonderful remnant it is. It is just as rebellious as was Judah before the conquest. And so you come to chapter 25, verse 22 of 2 Kings. Now, as for the people who were left in the land, Nebuchadnezzar appointed Gedaliah over them. And what do they do in verse 25? They struck Gedaliah down so that he died. Then all the people, both great and small, the captains of the forces, arose and went to Egypt, for they were afraid of the Chaldeans. They should be. I mean, they've rebelled against the Chaldeans 3 times. And 3 times the Babylonians have come in and put them down and reestablished their control. And now they set up Gedaliah, and so what do? They kill Gedaliah. And so we better get to Egypt before the Babylonians come back and, nail us a 4th time. And yet what was taking place in Babylon? Well, with Nebuchadnezzar's death, Jehoiachin is raised and was given a portion by the king each day. And that reminds us of what we read in Samuel, of what David did to Mephibosheth to honor the house of Saul. Jehoiachin, the continuing Davidic king who is in Babylon, is honored by the king of Babylon. The Davidic house survives, and more than survives, is being honored, if we can put it this way, by their Babylonian hosts. So that when the nation returns from Babylon, a scion within the house of David, a son of the house of David, will return as well, but we got to get to there in future days. Well, I said it is very interesting when you take a look at Solomon's reign. As I said, the central portion of the book is about the building and dedication of Samuel's reign in the book. Solomon's reign in the book is the building and the dedication of the temple. Now, it is very interesting. The first two chapters, which are balanced out by what is in chapter 11, show Solomon's coming to the throne. Even as we have seen in chapter 2 with the questions of David. David challenging Solomon to truly be a man and follow the ways of the Lord and follow the commandments of the Lord. And of course, what we see as Solomon becomes king is balanced out in chapter 11, even though he was charged by his father to be a man who would walk after the commandments of the Lord. In chapter 11, we find out that he didn't. And so his kingship, again, would not be established. But in chapter 3 and 4, and let's look at that. In chapter 3 and 4, the author recounts to us Yahweh's giving of wisdom to Solomon. And this is where the Lord comes to Solomon as Solomon offers sacrifices at Gibeon. The Lord appears to him in verse 5, "Ask what you wish me to give you." And Solomon prays, verse 9, "Give your servant a hearing heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil." I realize that I need to have a heart that hears you to be able to judge this people aright. And so the Lord says in verse 11, "Because you've asked this thing, and not for yourself, long life or riches, but have asked for yourself discernment, hearing, to understand justice. Behold, I have done according to your words. Behold, I have given you a wise and discerning heart. I have given you skill to be able to make judgments between people within your kingdom. And I'll also give you what you didn't ask for, riches and honor. So there will not be any among the kings like you all your days." You're going to be the supreme king upon the face of the earth during the entirety of your reign. "And if you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and commandments, as your father David walked, then I will prolong your days." Now, you didn't ask for riches, and you didn't ask for defeat of your enemies, and you didn't ask for long age. Now, you're going to get the riches, and you're going to become the preeminent king. But I'm not going to grant you long life unless you follow my ways. So even within the context of God granting Solomon wisdom, we need to realize it is a very nuanced wisdom. And we'll come back to talk about wisdom again in 502 when we get to the wisdom books and what wisdom is. But wisdom is the skill to be able to discern and distinguish so as to make proper judgments. And Solomon is given an insight into how the world runs. In fact, the author brings that up at the end of chapter 4. Verse 33, he spoke of trees. And he spoke of animals and birds and creeping things and fish. And all men came from all peoples to hear the wisdom of Solomon. From the kings of the earth who have heard have his wisdom. Basically, Solomon could give a seminar in how the world ticked and how people thought. And knowing about this world in which we live, how you could make skillful discernments so as to bring about the ends that you desired as a ruler. You know, he was basically the success guru of his day. You know, if you want to know how to be a CEO, if you really want to know how to motivate people and get people to do what you want them to do, and able to determine an end and how to get there, Solomon is your man. But even within the context, the wisdom that God gives still came with a challenge. You need to obey my commandments to get long days. Well, he didn't. And he didn't get as many years as Psalm 90 said, now was the lot of man, 70 years, and if by strength, 80. He dies before his 70 years. He doesn't get long life because in chapter 11 his disobedience. But he does have wealth. And that wealth is portrayed before us in chapter 10. But it's a wealth and wisdom that Solomon consumes upon himself. It's a self-gratifying wisdom rather than a God-honoring obedience and wisdom that comes. And we'll come back to all of this when we take a look at Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs on, what did Solomon know? And not when did he know it, but we know when he knew it. But, how extensive was his wisdom, and then how does God direct him to write so that we might have wisdom conveyed through Solomon. We'll put that off. Certainly it is here. He was wise. He was a wise and discerning king. And because of that, his kingship was great. But that wisdom did not lead him to the obedience of Yahweh. And in the end, that wisdom, as we said, was consumed upon himself. Well, in chapter 5, we have his building procedures that will be used as far as the building of the temple. That is reiterated as more building projects take place. That what he established for the building of the temple, he continues to use as king after the temple is completed in chapter 9. And yet, in the middle, as we've seen, we have the building and the dedication of the temple. That this is the preeminence event as far as the author of Kings is concerned. And then, going into that center section, what about this divided kingdom? Well, notice again how the narrative is structured. We've already brought this out. It concentrates in 1623 through 2 Kings chapter 13 upon 90 key years of Israel's history, beginning with Ahab, the worst king. And what did Ahab do? What is he well known for? The establishment of the worship of Baal in Israel. And really what the author is concentrating here, even in the divided kingdom, is how through Elijah and Elisha, Yahweh confronted the state-sanctioned worship of Baal and brought it down. And how God showed through the prophetic ministry of Elijah and Elisha that he was greater than Baal. Because the worship of the Baals was in Israel both before and after, and was in Judah both before and after. But it was never state-sanctioned like it was here. It was always done away on the high places. And of course, a lot like Solomon, basically Israel and Judah's history was a divided heart. They did both. They came to the temple, or they went to Bethel or Dan and worshipped Yahweh, and yet also turned and worshiped the Baals. But for 3 generations within Israel's history, they didn't have the facade of having a divided heart. They literally worshipped Baal. Baal was the one sanctioned by the house of Omri to be worshipped. And that becomes the centerpiece of the author of Kings showing, and you can see how much of Kings is devoted to this interaction between Yahweh and Baal. Because as Elijah so well said in 1 Kings chapter 18, if Yahweh is God, worship him. If Baal is God, worship him. But don't halt between the two opinions. Worship who is truly God. Well, one of the things that Yahweh shows as you go through Kings, he is truly God and will not countenance any kind of idolatry or half-hearted worship, turning to the idols completely, or divided worship as far as he is concerned. Now, it's very interesting as you're reading, he concentrates in chapters 12 to 14 with Jeroboam's reign in the north and Rehoboam's reign in the south, with the rise of idolatry in both Israel and Judah. Then in 15:1 to 16:22, it's almost like you're in the slideshow. Let me just get you from the kings in the north, from Jeroboam to Ahab, and let me just zip before you the kings in the south. Between Jeroboam and Jehoshaphat. And pop, there go the slides, and then he slows down and says, all right, let's concentrate upon Ahab and his sons' lives all the way through Jehu and the establishment of Jehu's dynasty. Let's deal with how God confronted the worship of Baal in the north. Then in 14 and 15 of 2 Kings, it's almost not, now the slideshow starts again. Click, 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 boom, 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 boom. Short paragraphs. Let me get through to the kings, to the end of the story, what was taking place in the north, and then what took place in 722 in the north, south. Ahaz, what was taking place in the south. How Ahaz is trying to buy off the Assyrians by installing in the very temple in Jerusalem an altar like the altar he had seen in Damascus, and how he is playing this religious game. We'll come back and talk about that when we deal with Isaiah in 5:02. And now how we have idolatry full bore within the south, and yet that kind of false altar is exactly what brings the downfall of the north in chapter 17. And so obviously God's judgment is going to come upon the south because of their sin as well. So you can notice how he concentrates the last couple of chapters. After 2 chapters deal with 62 years, numbers of kings, he slows down and just looks at Ahaz, and then looks at Ashur, the last king of the north, and talks about the idolatry in Judah and the exile of Israel. Now, I didn't put it up there, but obviously chapters 18 to 25 through to the appendix deal with the surviving kingdom. But even there, the author concentrates 3 chapters on Hezekiah and almost 2 chapters on Josiah. He concentrates upon these 2 good kings and how, because of Hezekiah's faithfulness, the Assyrians do not take Judah into captivity as they had the north. But then Hezekiah has a son, Manasseh. In fact, although we'll come back and deal again with this in Isaiah. But Manasseh is the Ahab of the south. So well, what makes you say that? Well, remember how Ahab was the worst of anyone that went before, who came after? Well, come to chapter 21 of 2 Kings. And it here talks about what Manasseh set up. And notice in verse 10, Yahweh spoke through his servants the prophets, saying, because Manasseh king of Judah has done these abominations, having done wickedly more than all the Amorites did who were before him. You know how bad Manasseh was? He was worse than the Canaanites that Israel destroyed, or should have destroyed, when they came in the land. The abominations he did were worse than even the abominations of the Amorites. Go all the way back to Genesis chapter 15. You know, the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete for the seed of Abraham to go into the land and take it. Now Manasseh is doing worse than the Canaanites. And he also made Judah sin with his idols. Therefore, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I am bringing such calamity on Jerusalem and Judah, that whoever hears of it, both his ears shall tingle. Going back to Deuteronomy 29. Because, verse 15, they have done evil in my sight and been provoked me to anger since the day their fathers came up from Egypt, even till this day. Manasseh has taken all of the evil that Israel has done from Egypt till now and has concentrated into his reign. And so God's judgment is certain. So why in chapter 22 and chapter 23 the emphasis upon Josiah? Because God had determined the judgment is going to come. Yet because of Josiah's faithfulness, God said, notice in 2 Kings 23, 26 and 27, however, Yahweh did not turn from the fierceness of his great wrath, the anger which burned against Judah, because of the provocations which Manasseh had provoked him. And the Lord said, I will remove Judah also from my sight as I removed Israel. I'll cast off Jerusalem, the city I've chosen. The temple of which I've said my name shall be there. Now Josiah, because of his faithfulness, stops that judgment for a generation. And then with Josiah's death, God takes the punishment upon Judah because of Manasseh. Now this is going to become very, very important. We're going to come back to it in Jeremiah. That even though Josiah was a good king, during his reign, the people went along with Josiah, but they still continued to practice what? The sins of Manasseh. And when Josiah is gone, it becomes full-born again. There wasn't a change of heart as far as the people as a total were concerned. So the author is going to concentrate upon Hezekiah and Josiah because their faithfulness stops God's judgment for a while. but in the end, it does not put off the inevitable. And so Israel goes into captivity. And let me just say a word about bibliography, then we'll take our break and on into the interpretive issues. A good exegetical commentary on Kings is yet to be written. You can look at K&D, you can look at the excellent work that has been done in Exposited Bible Commentary by Hostel and Patterson. Passable are the two works in the Word Biblical Commentary series, but they're not the final word. We need a good exegetical commentary on Kings, and it's really it's not in publication as we are speaking, and the publishers are not rushing to get one into press. Because I'm sure the pressure is not upon them to produce works that exegetes can use, because everyone is dying to preach Kings. But there are a couple of good works as far as English interpretation. More historically based, outstanding archaeologist is Donald Wiseman, and has brought a lot of the archaeological record, the extra biblical record, to bear on his Tyndale commentary on Kings. And so is very, very valuable for his historical material. Ian Provo deals more with Kings in a theological fashion. And so talking about the theological implications of the author and what is within the book is a passable commentary, and one that you should consult. And then two expositional works. The work by Paul House, and I put it there because House, probably more than any other author of the NAC, really took seriously what the purpose of the volumes were, which is to give solid exposition that could be used in preaching. And even though those aren't messages like Davis's work on 1 Kings, his work on 2 Kings still needs to be published, but and he's working on it, but House certainly deals extensively with, and what's the present day implication for what we read in Kings. And so is a valuable commentary, both interpretively and I think more significantly expositionally, on really talking about application in present day preaching to believers. And then he enunciates the principles, and Davis, at least for 1 Kings, gives you an awareness of how you can take that and craft messages from Kings for a contemporary audience. So these are the volumes. House is a hardback. The other three are paperback. They're all very, very reasonably priced. Really you can get all of this for very, very reasonable rates, and have some good resources for Kings. But to do good exegetical work, I'd point you to Exposited Bible Commentary and the Word Biblical Commentary series, and basically use expositors to correct historically and exegetically some of the fallacious conclusions that are in the Word Biblical Commentary series. So the work in expositors is excellent, and the work in Word is satisfactory, but a much better standalone volume on Kings needs to come forth. So maybe the NICOT will do that. Maybe there'll be some other series. Maybe even the Apollo series will give us a good work on Kings, although I won't hold my breath on what we see in the first two volumes come out, in that it's the Apollos, the Apollos series that has come out. All right, when we come to Kings, liberals and evangelicals alike speak about the fact that the overarching interpretive issue of the book is the chronology of the kings. It's universally agreed that we have chronological issues that are here. Part of the problem, even as you read through the book, what makes Kings very hard to read. Let me come here, is how the king, we said, he starts, what takes place in Israel. And he starts off by going through the reign of Jeroboam, who reigns for 22 years. Then he comes back and deals with, I'm sorry, that should have been Israel. Then he comes back and deals with Judah. Now, he picks it up with Rehoboam, but Rehoboam is only 17 years, so he continues on with the kings of Judah until Jeroboam dies. And that comes to an end, and then he goes back and reverts back to the north and continues on. And then we'll come back, and he's continually doing this. And it's very, very frustrating to the reader. And not only that, but he tells you how many years a certain king reigned. And yet what we start to recognize is that north and south are not necessarily following exactly the same calendar. And what I've done, I'll run this off for you. You can have a copy on Friday. Just kind of look along with me at this point. Now when I give you the data of the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel, it's not that these kings were contemporaneous, but you can see what I bring up here. Why he deals with Jeroboam 22 years, then Rehoboam 17, Abijah 3, and then Asa. So he goes through Asa, then he cuts back to what was taking place in the north. And you realize a lot happens in the north before Asa's rule comes to an end. But that's, like Judges, not the ultimate problem. The problem is that the author makes it very, very clear with every king in the north and south exactly how long he reigned. Right? He reigned for X amount of years. Or some don't get years, they just get days or months because they didn't make it a year. All right? But what you do is you go down, and there's the kings of Judah, and you list all of the years, and this is exactly what the author of Kings tells us. And so you come up, and I'm going to put the 2 3-month reigns there as well. Realize these are 0.25, not 25. That little point makes all the difference in the world. The total for the kings of Judah, when you add it all up, is 394 and a half years. You go through the kings of Israel. And of course, we got our 7-day wonder in Zimri. We have our 1-month wonder in Shalom. And so I just, put it and add it all together. And you've also got Zechariah, who has 6 months. I just put it at 21.5. Actually, of course, it's about 21.65 when you add up everybody else. But here's the problem. Just like Judges, there's not enough time for consecutive kingships in either Judah or Israel. For using the most broad scale that we have, and realize there's debates within about 10 years, 9 years, 10 years between Thilly and Albright on exactly when the divided kingdom is established. We go with Thilly's dating, 931 BC, to 722, 586 BC. You've got 210 years in the north, but 241 years, plus a few months. In the south is 345 years, but you have approximately 395 years. that in the north we're a little over 30 years off. In the south, we are closing in on 50 years difference between the actual historical record that can be verified from extra-biblical material and the record that we have within Kings itself. Now, how we're able to determine that, and Kaiser gets into how the eponym lists of the Assyrians are used, and that then is dealt with four other extra-biblical materials that have come to us from the Assyrians and the Egyptians and the Greeks and the Babylonians before that, so that we can fix on the basis of a eclipse that can be fixed, that Ahab's death is 553 BC, and Jehu's reign begins in 841 BC, because they're mentioned in the Assyrian records. And by taking a look at the dating there, we're able then to move before and after and have some idea of the different ways in which the author has used his material. Now, we can't be sure exactly how it applies in every case. But generally, it seems that first of all, in the north and south, separate calendars were used. Generally, Israel began their year in Nisan or in spring, March, April. Judah began its year in Tishri, September, October, the fall. Tied in with that is the accession, non-accession year dating. That's in the ancient Near East, there developed how an accession year, that is the time from when the king began his reign until the new year, was considered to be his accession year and was not counted within the totality of his reign. So that calendar year, and then whatever calendar year he died, that is how they would add it up. And so the time of the reign until the new year was not counted in the total years. And that system was used in Judah, it's believed, until Jehoram and the influence of the north. And then in Israel, after they reestablish their kingship under Jehoash, they seem to use the accession year, but the accession year is counted on the non-accession year dating. So that first part of the year leading up to the new year was the first year of the reign. Now, this really becomes a headache when you think in terms of separate calendars. Let me just deal with it this way. We're going to have a king who begins his reign in August. So that under the non-accession year dating, from August to September becomes what? Year 1. Then he reigns a whole calendar year, and in fact, we're going to have him die in December. Under a non-accession year dating, with the new year beginning in September, he would have a total of how many years? A 3-year reign. Now we're going to have that same king become king in August and die a year and a half approximately later in December, with a non-accession year that begins in March. So from August to March is his ascension year. That's year what? 0. Then his reign begins March, April, but he doesn't make it to the next year. So with an accession year dating, or the non-accession year dating to the new year, and then into his third year, you put the calendar together with the non-ascension year dating, and this king, the author would say, has ruled 3 years. But using a calendar that begins in the spring with an accession year dating, the same reign would be said he ruled 1 year. And so you've got 2 years. Now this is pretty much seen today as we take a look at calendars within the ancient Near East, all right? And everyone doesn't go along with, Philly's conclusions, and what I've said here is based upon his solution in taking the separate calendar and ascension, non-ascension year dating, and saying, all right, we can start to see how there could be up to a 2-year difference in the determination of a king's reign. Third of all, national dating. It seems as though the author of Kings, when he says Rehoboam, reigned for 17 years, Jeroboam 22 years, all right, he is using at that point the dating system used in the south, the dating system used in the north. But when he says that a certain king in the north became king in the X year of the king in Judah, at that point, the king in Judah is being determined as far as his year based upon the northern reckoning, not the southern reckoning. See how many different elements go in to try to figure out the chronology that we face, and throw all of that in with co-regencies. Talked about that with Solomon. Solomon became king while David was still alive. Therefore, the 40 years of David's reign, the 40 years of Solomon's reign, includes some time period where both Solomon and David were king. And at times, 2 or even 3 kings would reign at the same time. And that overlapping period would be considered for both. So here is King A, and during the end of his reign, he has a co-regency with King B. We'll just say at this point that co-regency was 5 years. Now the author says, okay, the reign of King A was 20 years, and we'll keep it simple. The reign of King B is 20 years, but that's not 40 years. That's 35 years, because 5 of those years, there's an overlap between the two. So that these 20 years includes 5 years that's also included for King B. So you read it first and think we're dealing with 40 years of chronology. Actually, we're dealing with 35 years of chronology. And now there is general agreement today, as I have put down with the chronology of the kings, at least in evangelical circles of either B or C, and you can see that all of the commentaries I've given to you basically follow the conclusions that came up with by Philly. Let me put this title down there for you. This is the third edition. Edwin Thilly's The Mysterious Number of the Hebrew Kings. This is one of the most influential and important books that has been read, that has been written in the last 100 years of Old Testament studies. As I said, and by the way, this is based upon a doctoral dissertation done in that great bastion of evangelical scholarship, the University of Chicago. Now, Thilly was an evangelical. We won't get as far as... He was a Seventh-day Adventist. He was conservative. He, in most places, would be Orthodox. And he set himself, as his life worked, to unravel the conundrum of the chronology of the kings. In Kings, and that's where most of his data came from, and bringing in Chronicles as well. But devote yourself to that. I mean, you finish with 501 and say, now what I want to devote the rest of my life to is unraveling the chronology of the kings in 1st and 2nd Kings. I don't think many of you will be led to that as your life work. Well, Thilly was. And went to the University of Chicago because of its vast archaeological resources that were there for him to use, and wrote a thesis, a dissertation accepted by that evangelical, no, I'm joking, of course, that very liberal Old Testament department at the University of Chicago, and then published it. And because of where it's written, it has had great impact upon liberal scholarship as well. It's one of those conservative works that's really impacted liberals as well. Now, there are still some liberals remain who take position A. The data in Kings is totally unreliable. But they're harder to find after Thilly. There are some evangelicals who take position B. The data is accurate, but we don't have the tools today to be able to unravel it. It's unsolvable. Through what Thilly proposed, and what I've just gone over with those four issues that can help us to appreciate, and then he applies it to the material. And basically, Thilly's approach was C. The data is accurate and is generally solvable. Even Thilly says there is a conundrum when you come to the dating of Hezekiah that is very, very hard to unravel. Now, he gives a solution. And if anything that Thilly has proposed, that has been one of the greatest points of debate still to this day. But as you can tell, all the commentaries that I have recommended for you would take position C, and I would too. The data is accurate. Now, a liberal would say and take position C, the data is generally accurate. The Albright school would take that position, the more conservative liberals. And I know it's hard to say, but the more conservative liberals would take C. They wouldn't acclaim inerrancy, that the material's accurate, but they would say it's generally accurate. In fact, more accurate than probably anything else that has come from the ancient Near East as far as history is concerned, is in Kings. But of course, they're not inerrantists, so they'll just say generally accurate and generally solvable. So that most conservative liberals, as the charts in Walton show you, because only Thilly is a conservative with those dates that are listed for you. Here's the kings of Israel. Remember that chart. And there's Thilly, the individual I'm talking to, I'm talking to you, but talking about Thilly. All right, here's his dating scheme for the kings of the north. And Azenhooker, Bright, and Cogden, and Tadmor are what we might call more conservative liberals.
Can you move that down just a bit so I can see the title?
Well, this is right here, the kings of Israel. But what I want to show you is all Walton has done has said, all right, here are the 4 basic schemes that are out there today in the academic community. This is the one that most evangelicals follow. Tilly basically has carried the day among evangelicals. But obviously he has chastened but not carried the day with the liberals. But these are more conservative liberals who will use the same 4-pronged basis I've just given to you on saying we have to apply the issues of different New Years, accession, non-accession, and co-regencies, and then realize that you got to take a look, is the author talking about the North or the South, and he's at that point determining the dates based upon what kingdom he is speaking about within that context. Those general principles are applied, but as you can see, and that's what we say, generally solvable, that obviously different dating schemes have been come up with. But notice, all within basically 10 years of one another. Right, now, the mix also is bringing in, as I said, extra biblical material to get the fixed dates like we have them here. Would I go to the stake for Thilly? No. In the end, he's just another human interpreter of Scripture. And like any human interpreter, dealing with both the biblical text and then seeking to at times use extra biblical data to make determinations about the interpretation of the biblical text, he could be misreading the extra biblical data and bringing in, faulty data to say this is how we are to understand the Bible at this point. Is the Bible accurate? The answer, yes. Now then it becomes a faith issue between liberals and conservatives on whether it's generally accurate or whether it is completely accurate. And you know what side of the equation I and we fall upon in that conclusion. You'll get that in Theology 1. We do believe in biblical inerrancy, that the text, as originally come from the author of Kings, is historically accurate. Now, can we interpret it always accurately? Not necessarily. But that's our problem, not the text problem. The text is accurate.
Under the co-regency idea, does that include when a king was anointed versus when they actually started reigning?
Yes. Well, not with David.
Not with David.
Because the text makes it very, very clear. It's talking about the 7.5 years when he was in Hebron, and then the 33.5 years that he was in Jerusalem. So on those, no. But like with Solomon, Solomon's acclaimed king. At that point, he would begin his rule as king because David's already senile. All right, so we would assume at that point, Solomon becoming king, he starts to exercise kingship because David is no longer able to do so. But David continues on, and his life doesn't end until he dies, and his kingship doesn't end until he dies. All right, now, that's with David and Solomon. Later on, we have really true co-regencies. Well, we got Uzziah who develops leprosy, and so his son, Jotham. And Jotham seems to establish Ahaz, and Ahaz, Hezekiah as kings. And that's a place where we might have, with Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, we might really have a 3-part, although Uzziah is not exercising any kind of kingly authority at that point. But he's still alive. And so those years continue to be included among the years of his kingship. So it's dicey. And some of the minimalists, some of the more skeptical liberals will attack other liberals and certainly we conservatives as this is special pleading. In other words, you're using this to try to save biblical authority or biblical inerrancy. So there has been in the last 10 years a real reaction against this in more skeptical liberal circles. I can't say any more that Philly has has influenced every last liberal, because we are attacked until he is attacked for special pleading to save his inerrancy, or and I'm not sure it was a complete inerrancy, but at least biblical authority. You're trying to save an orthodox theology, by the special pleading. But gentlemen, just get ready for that. That's going to be the last attack of every skeptical liberal, upon those of us who inerrant us. That in the end you're just using this to plead your case for why the Bible is inerrant. It isn't, and yet we would point and say, but there's a lot of liberals who see the general historical reliability today of kings. But in the end, that's not evangelism. It's just academic scholarship, and it is the gospel that will convert a person, not whether you can prove whether the kings are, the chronology of the kings is accurate or not. If you believe the gospel, it is accurate. If you don't believe the gospel, it isn't. It's that clear. So, and then when you fall to write a commentary, and let's face it, most expositors and most exegetes have not spent their life trying to figure out, what is accurate and what isn't as far as Kings is concerned, chronologically.